perspective of one, African history, but also African American history, and kind of showing where the two of them intersect. Because a lot of times we'll get African American history from an American perspective up until about 1960. Then we learn about Jesse Jackson and then Obama. And it tends to stop there. And then African history, we learn a little bit about African independence, and then it stops there. So I figured by merging the two, we could kind of touch on two different areas from different perspectives and merge them together. So Pan Africanism is essentially a series of movements, both ideological and physical, that involves the unification of people of African descent for the betterment, for mutual betterment of the situation in Africa as well as the situation throughout the diaspora. So Brittany's in my class, and we've been kind of breaking down the terminology to work out a nice definition we can work with, and also trying to outline the history of the movement to show how it got to 1960s and then what happened beyond 1960s. So we just finished the Garvey era, so we have a little bit of ways to go, but essentially it's important to learn that this whole idea of unity of people of African descent began much earlier than the 1960s. So we started out at about the Haitian Revolution. Some people argue it goes back earlier than that.
I was like, maybe.
But the Haitian Revolution was really a defining marker in terms of international history, not only for African people, but worldwide. Of course, it was in part inspired by, heavily influenced by the French Revolution, but it was also significant because although it took place in Haiti, it involved people from other areas around the Caribbean and parts of the Americas, you could argue. So the Haitian Revolution was kicked off by a ceremony that happened in the woods. The leader of that ceremony, the religious leader of that ceremony, was a man by the name of Boukman Dutty. And they say that he originated from Jamaica, but he found himself in Haiti initiating this religious ceremony that would then spark off the Haitian Revolution. And through Ortiz's work, I know you've been finding connections also with Latin America and Haiti in terms of, was it the Venezuelan flag was flown there first? And the homage they paid to Bolivar, the Bolivarian Revolution, and all those connections. So it's important because it's really one of the first international African movements that was very successful. And so a lot of people in the Americas then look to Haiti as kind of like the marker of what we can potentially become. So 1791 is Haiti. I'm not going to go through all the history, but 1800s we begin to see the solidification of African American and African religious traditions. Particularly people of African descent are allowed to worship in their own churches. A lot of them fight for the right to worship in their own churches. So you begin to see breakoffs from the Methodist Church, and you get the AME Church, which Richard Allen spearheaded in 1819 out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and eventually began to spread. You find a lot of AME churches here throughout the South. You also find people in the Caribbean, such as Prince Hall, who was the head of the Prince Hall Masons, which was the black branch of the Freemason Society, the secret organization, quote unquote. But so they expanded as well from the Caribbean, so that you then get Caribbean influence in the Americas as well. So to fast forward, I guess, a little bit, we get to the early 1900s, you begin to see huge migrations, not only of African Americans in the South moving up north, but you also begin to see Caribbeans coming from the Caribbean to America. And part of that was fueled by this spur of military change and transformation surrounding World War I. So World War I, you have a lot of people in America going off to Europe to fight. As a result, you need to replace that labor. So they get a lot of labor from the Caribbean, a lot of labor from the South. So that sparks off this giant migration of labor movements and of people. And as a result, you then have people from America coming into contact with people from the Caribbean, people from Latin America, and other parts of the world. And because you have Jim Crow in America, they begin to be treated along the same lines or very similar lines. So they recognize that their struggles are very similar. Also in World War I, you begin to have Caribbean regiments who are sent to Europe. And although they're tasked with fighting on behalf of the British, they don't want them to get comfortable with the idea of killing Europeans or white people. So they have them digging trenches, they have them, driving the trucks, and putting them in harm's way in ways that they really can't defend themselves. On top of that, they begin to see these metropoles, these areas where they looked up to it at one point. So you have people from the Caribbean going to England and seeing what England is really looking like. And not only what it looks like, but what it looks like in the middle of a war. And that's a very different feeling than what you're told about, the British superiority or English superiority. So they begin to break down some of these stereotypes and then begin to unify. So flash forward to the early 1900s in America. Intellectually, you've got people like Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey comes in later, but Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and they're really pushing for this uplift of people of African descent. Du Bois, from an intellectual perspective, has this theory of the talented tenth, which he later reforms and says we need something more like a guiding hundredth or guiding thousandth because talented tenth aren't doing anything. So he develops this Pan-African movement and takes it to Paris and says, we can begin to unify people. And he holds a series of what are called Pan-African Congresses. The first one is held in 1900. I'm not sure exactly when each of the successive ones are held, but the fifth one, I believe, was held in 1945. And so these are significant movements because they involve people of African descent coming together in congresses from all over the world in one major place. So you've got people from Africa, people from the Caribbean, people from America, sharing their experiences. And then in these conferences, they're also writing ratifications and constitutions for what they want to see and presenting them in the international community. Booker T. Washington was arguing along similar lines here in America. He was more so about industrial uplift, but they both had the same goals, which was to see the upliftment of African people here in America. All right, so we got that. Fast forward a little bit, we get into the post-World War I era. World War I ends 1918. You have a flood, an influx of people coming back into America. A lot of these people are war veterans. Some of the black people now have military training. You also have some of the other veterans who come back and are looking for jobs. The problem is a lot of these jobs have been taken by cheap labor from the South and from the Caribbean. So you begin to see conflicts arising as to how come I can't get a job. And in some cases, when workers strike, they bring in strike breakers who come from these Caribbean countries or from the South. And then it creates a conflict along racial lines, it creates a conflict along class lines, and so forth. So we get into 1919, and they have what Florida's James Weldon Johnson called the Red Summer. And it's called the Red Summer because it was one of the largest series of movements of racial riots in the country. I believe there was over 30 cities had race riots within that one summer of 1919 alone. And that was in part because of the labor situation, also in part because you have military veterans who are armed and know how to use guns and trained as well. So this creates the Red Summer. As a result of the Red Summer, we begin to see organizations sprout up throughout the Americas. The UNIA has formed a couple years earlier in Jamaica and comes to America. You also have organizations like the African Blood Brotherhood, which is formed by a Caribbean national, comes to America, and he's ex-military, so he has military training. And the African Blood Brotherhood was intended to be a secret society whose objectives weren't clearly stated because it was a secret society. But they were set up in almost a paramilitary structure. So you have posts throughout the Americas, mainly throughout the South, and these posts are named after prominent African leaders. So you have Menelik Post after Emperor Menelik, who was the emperor in Ethiopia during the Battle of Adwa. Not to give too much history at once. The Battle of Adwa was significant. 1896, because prior to that, the European countries got together and said, we're going to carve up Africa and decide which European country gets control of which part of the continent. Italy gets Ethiopia, so Italy decides to come into Ethiopia. However, the Ethiopians are aware of this, they unify, they fight, and they fight back, and they kick out the Italians, and they're the only African country to actually kick out the colonizing power that was intended to come in and take them over. So Emperor Menelik was the one that organized that unification, and it was actually significant because people throughout the world heard about this. So there was actually accounts of Africans in Brazil attacking Italians in Brazil because they heard Italians had invaded Ethiopia. So although they're not from Ethiopia, there's this idea of unification and unity. So early 1900s, we get these organizations emerging throughout the Americas. And again, many of them are tasked with the upliftment of African people. Some of them are combating labor issues in terms of trying to get wages for people, trying to get jobs for people. Some of them are tasked with voting rights, trying to get people the right to vote. Some of them are tasked with combating lynchings and the violence that people are facing on a daily basis. And some of them are just based off of this whole idea of mutual aid. And that formed in the 1800s as well, where you have mutual aid societies that are tasked with this idea of providing mutual aid and mutual benefits for people. So back then, that was before insurance companies had come about. So if somebody died in your community, you had to have a way to kind of take care of their families afterwards. So a lot of people were members of either churches or other mutual aid organizations where they pay monthly dues, probably 25 cents, 5 cents, which was a lot of money at the time, a month. And then when you die, your wife or your spouse would get a certain amount of money, and your kids would get a certain amount of money and be taken care of.
The Knights of Pythias.
Knights of Pythias, right. Knights of Pythias, the Freemasons had a similar organization, Daughters of the Eastern Star, and the list goes on and on. But these are organizations that developed in 1900s, 1800s, and continued up until even today. And I think it's important because a lot of these organizations were instrumental in the civil rights movement that would continue after that. So we get this unification that comes about. Early 1920s, we get the UNIA coming into America, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, founded by Marcus Garvey, and as we learned, Amy Jakes Garvey and Amy Ashwood Garvey, who were his wives at separate times in his life. But it's important to note because women tend to get overlooked a lot in these early movements, but they were very instrumental in terms of setting up a lot of these infrastructures. So his first wife was actually with him in Jamaica as a teenager and set up the organization before he went to America and spread the message. But the UNIA was important because it was the largest African organization and probably one of the largest organizations in the world at the time. At its height, it had over 2 million members around the world. And it had branches throughout South Africa, West and East Africa, throughout the Caribbean, throughout Latin America, and throughout America. And they might even have some through Asia. I know that Ho Chi Minh used to sit in on UNIA meetings in Harlem before he started the revolution in Vietnam. So it became an international movement very, very quickly. So it's very important to look at it from that international perspective. So Garvey comes to America and spreads this message of going back to Africa, which was already being discussed way before then in terms of going to Sierra Leone or going to Liberia. But he says, we can actually do this. So he sets up businesses to try to raise money, and he sets up the Black Star Line. So the Black Star Line is a shipping company that he intended to create to send people back to Africa. People don't realize is the Black Star Line was in some ways modeled after the White Star Line, whose chief ship was known as the Titanic. So the idea was if they can create a shipping company, we too can create a shipping company. And so he modeled that after the Black Star Line. People saw this as very influential. A lot of people bought in. He had some bad business ventures. FBI was watching him heavily. There was a movement amongst African American leaders to try to get Garvey out of the country. So he gets indicted on mail fraud, arguing things like he says it's the best and biggest shipping company when it's not. That's false advertising. That's illegal. They throw him in jail. He eventually gets pardoned and sent back to, he gets extradited. He eventually goes to England, lives out the rest of his life in England. And so the movement kind of breaks down from there. But what you have is a lot of residual effects that come out of that. So future African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah show that they're very heavily influenced by the message of Marcus Garvey. And they do things like put the Black Star in the middle of the Ghanaian flag in homage to Marcus Garvey and his Black Star Line. Also, you then have people who were heavily involved in the Marcus Garvey movement who either start new movements or have that message and take that message with them throughout the rest of their lives. So you have people like Malcolm X who emerge as a result of his father being a Garveyite and being in a movement, and eventually being killed by the Klan. So these people emerge out of a result of the residuals of these organizations that are left behind. Also, Marcus Garvey was very instrumental in setting up some newspapers and printing presses. He was professionally trained as a printer, learned printing and did printing with the noble Drews Ali in England, and then came back to America. That's a whole other story I'll explain another time. But he brings these printing presses and this ideas of these newspapers to America with him. So you have a lot of black newspapers that are already here, and then you have this other newspaper, Caribbean-based largely, from Caribbeans up north. and they begin to write, and other people then begin to write into his newspapers. But what's important is at this time you have an increase in black literacy. And a lot of it is due in large part to the fact that you have all these newspapers, and you now have text for people to read other than the Bible, and you now have news that needs to be spread. So what happened was, to try to navigate and to circumnavigate the fact that there's not very good infrastructure for disseminating black newspapers out the country, you have different informal methods being set up. So you'd have sleeping car porters that would travel from the north to the south, and what they do is they get a package of these magazines or newspapers like the New Negro, and rather than taking them and distributing them openly, which of course wouldn't be allowed in many southern towns, what they would do is they have designated drop-off points. So when the train is passing through a city, you take them, throw them out the window, or throw them out the train car, and then a group of people come in, pick them up, and distribute them throughout the city. So you have these informal networks that then develop around that. And you also then have increase in literacy, because although people can't read, they make sure that the younger generation can read. And so as a result of that, you have people then whose jobs they get paid is to actually read the newspapers aloud in certain venues. So you have people like Carter G. Woodson, who would become the second PhD student out of Harvard University, first in history. And he actually started, while he was a coal miner in Virginia, he made money on the side by reading the newspaper in a barbershop as a kid. At the age of 20, he eventually got to go back to high school. From high school, he eventually went out to Harvard, and the rest is history, of course. So you begin to see unifications around education as well. Okay, so these networks then, they all tie into these African movements. Excuse me. Because you have colonialism going on around the same time, and people are realizing that they have commonalities amongst their oppressive situations throughout the world. So before I get to the African situation, 1930s and 40s, you have several major events that go on throughout the Americas. The Scottsboro case is a very significant event, and the Scottsboro boys were a group of teenage boys that got accused of rape. It got heavy press in terms of national press and international press, because they were so young, because they were sentenced to death on the death penalty, because the jury was all white, because a whole lot of things going on. There was a whole lot of issues going on with their trial. There was a speedy trial and many other things. But there were actually sailors in Germany that were writing petitions trying to get the Scottsboro boys off for these crimes that they had been alleged to commit. So you have that issue going on. 1940s, throughout this whole history, there's a continuation of lynchings and the studying of lynchings and the proliferation of lynchings. 1930s and 40s, you have the NAACP, which had been around since early 1900s. And they've actually been tabulating some of these lynchings. So you actually have records now of how many lynchings are going on, where they're happening at, and they begin to actually do further investigations into a lot of these lynchings and provide legal service to people who are either involved in lynchings or involved in rapes of some sort or major traumatic events. Rosa Parks, who many of you know for sitting on the back of the bus, was actually a field organizer for the NAACP before she sat on the back of the bus in Montgomery. And as a result of her organizing work at NAACP, she was in direct contact with people who were rape victims, particularly from race-related rapes. So all that stuff led into the 1950s and the 1960s, which is why we're here today. And the 1950s were significant, in part because of what was going on here, but also on the African continent, where you have African countries becoming independent. So a lot of African leaders came to Americas for their education. When they came to America, they came in contact with the racism here, the segregation here, and also the fights for movements. So that leads us into the 1950s. I can continue further if you want, or we can talk about the Tallahassee bus boycott, if you want to go into...
Well, you folks have questions for Justin about these?
I did, but I lost it. So. I just want to say it's beautiful to hear, because I've heard like the vague notion of like, the master narrative, and like specifically with the Rosa Parks incident, oh, it's just like this woman who sat on the bus. But to hear like so many years of backstory and to hear what she did before is really powerful, and it makes a really clear, concise case that it wasn't just, just like a decade of good stuff. So thank you.
One of the things, Mrs. Dixie, we've talked a lot about people like yourself and Mariola Gaines and others, even before the bus boycott in Tallahassee, many African Americans were challenging segregation, refusing to move back to the bus, right? And that's where Reverend Steele played a big role, because he would often come down and try to get people who've been incarcerated out of jail, right?
Yes.
Never heard it. But that resistance is often, it's kind of under the radar screen. We tend to focus on one or two people, but here it was deep and it was very intense.
Later.
So it's important to always remember that these connections went both ways. So it wasn't just one person going to another place or another. But to say that, it's also important to know that a lot of people haven't really studied the African contributions to American civil rights here. Because there were cases where African leaders would come on diplomatic trips and they would have to go stay in a hotel, and the hotel doesn't accept them because they're considered black, and then the US government has to then step in and say, you need to have these people in your hotel. We interviewed Justin's grandmother yesterday, and she touched on that, and how that helped to desegregate some of the hotels in Georgia as a result of African leaders coming in for whatever reason. And the US government pretty much saying, all the stuff in your hotel comes from up north, and if you don't allow these people to stay here, we're going to call that off. So you have to open up. And so that doesn't get touched on real quick yet.
You bring up a really good, interesting point. What did blackness mean? Because, in America, you're like, okay, the African Americans, we're going to suppress them, but then you're right, the Africans come over and they're considered black, even though they're not Americans. So they're subjected, and the Caribbean people, they're subjected to the same treatment, even though they weren't American, and that their struggle was not with, the white supremacy. So how did blackness, or the idea of blackness,
The idea of blackness in America was the one-drop rule. So they argued if you had one drop of black blood, you were considered black. Of course, a lot of it was based off of phenotype, because they're not out there testing everybody to see how much black blood you have. So the idea was based off of your color alone, you were considered black. If you were darker than what they considered white, you were considered black. And for some people, it wasn't even necessarily being of African descent. It was just not being white. It was enough to be considered black in some cases. Now that varied throughout different parts of the Americas. Latin America, you have all kinds of variations with mulattoes and so forth. So that varied. But to get back to your question, these movements in the 60s then impacted African independence in the 60s and earlier, because what you then had was people and organizations moving from here and going back to Africa for whatever reason. So after the Black Panther Party, near the end of its reign, I guess you could say, they began to mobilize in Africa, and Algeria actually set up a place for them. So they had an international branch of the Black Panther Party in Algeria, and a lot of people who were either in political trouble here or began to expand abroad went to Algeria, and then some then went on to other parts of African countries to help with independence movements. Also tied to that, in India, the Dalits in India organized a similar party along the lines of the Black Panther Party. And so from that, they saw this message that they could take and extract and implant upon their own situation in India. So it impacted independence movements that not just in Africa, but also in Asia as well. So there's that. And there's many other movements too. A lot of SNCC organizers, like the one we're talking about, are in Jamaica now. And they're doing organizing work in Jamaica. They've got an international school for bottom-up organizing, which actually links Jamaicans with Colombians, and they're expanding to Ecuador next. And so they actually have Jamaicans going to Colombia to teach and learn farming practices and sustainable development practices and bring it back to their communities. And in Tanzania, I was there a couple years ago, and there's a ex-Black Panthers that are living there. And they've started an orphanage / community center / recording studio / study abroad program. A whole bunch of stuff that they have going on there. So a lot of these movements have been broken off and expanded into different areas and different sections.
Thanks, Justin.